Marcus Thompson adjusted his worn camouflage jacket as he walked through the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Heights. The morning sun cast long shadows between the perfectly manicured lawns and identical white picket fences. Every house looked like it had been cut from the same cookie cutter, with their beige siding and red brick accents. The only sounds were the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a dog behind a privacy fence. Marcus had been living in the neighborhood for 3 months now, renting a small house at the end of Elm Street. After 15 years serving his country, including 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, he was finally trying to build a normal life. The transition from military to civilian life hadn't been easy. Some days he still woke up expecting to hear reveille at 0500 hours, but instead found himself in a quiet bedroom with sunlight streaming through curtains his sister had picked out for him. The neighborhood was different from anywhere he had ever lived. Growing up in Detroit, Marcus was used to diversity, noise, and life happening on every corner. Here in Maplewood Heights, everything was controlled, planned, and regulated by the Homeowners Association. When he first moved in, his landlord had given him a thick packet of rules and regulations. No loud music after 9 p.m., no parking on the grass, no decorations that weren't approved by the HOA board. The list went on for pages. As Marcus walked toward the community mailboxes at the end of the street, he noticed a woman in her 50s watching him from her front porch. She had perfectly styled blonde hair and wore a pink polo shirt with white capri pants. Her eyes followed his every step, and she clutched her phone like she was ready to make a call at any moment. This wasn't the first time he had noticed her watching him. In fact, several neighbors had been giving him strange looks since he moved in. Margaret Whitman, better known to her neighbors as the self-appointed guardian of Maplewood Heights, had been president of the HOA for 6 years running. She took her position very seriously, perhaps too seriously according to some residents. Margaret believed that maintaining property values and community standards required constant vigilance. She had installed ring cameras around her property and kept detailed logs of any violations she observed in the neighborhood. When Margaret first noticed the new resident at the end of Elm Street, she immediately became suspicious. He was different from the typical Maplewood Heights resident. Most of her neighbors were white, middle-aged professionals who drove luxury cars and worked in corporate offices downtown. This man was black, wore military clothing, and drove an older pickup truck that had seen better days. In Margaret's mind, these differences were red flags that required investigation. Marcus reached the mailbox cluster and pulled out his keys. As he sorted through his mail, he heard footsteps approaching behind him. He turned to see the blonde woman from the porch walking directly toward him with determined strides. Her expression was stern, and she carried herself with the authority of someone used to being in charge. "Excuse me," Margaret called out when she was still 20 feet away. "I need to speak with you right now." Marcus looked up from his mail, surprised by the confrontational tone. He had dealt with difficult people before, but usually not at 8 a.m. while checking his mail. "Good morning," he replied politely, maintaining the respectful demeanor that had been drilled into him during his military training. Margaret stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Marcus could smell her expensive perfume. She looked him up and down, her eyes focusing particularly on his camouflage jacket. "I'm Margaret Whitman, president of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association. I've been watching you, and I have some serious concerns about your presence in this neighborhood." The accusatory tone caught Marcus off guard. He had been nothing but respectful to his neighbors, kept his property clean, and followed every HOA rule in that thick packet. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what you mean. Is there a problem with something I've done?" Margaret crossed her arms and raised her voice so that other neighbors who were starting their morning routines could hear. "The problem is that you clearly don't belong here. This is a family neighborhood with standards. We don't allow people like you to loiter around in military costumes, probably stolen valor if you ask me." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. After everything he had sacrificed for his country, after losing friends in combat, after struggling with nightmares and adjustment issues, this woman was questioning his service. His jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Ma'am, I live here. I rent the house at 1247 Elm Street, and this jacket isn't a costume. I served 15 years in the Army." Margaret scoffed loudly, making sure her voice carried to the growing number of neighbors who were now watching from their yards and windows. "I highly doubt that. Real soldiers don't dress like that in civilian areas. You're probably some homeless person or criminal trying to scam sympathy from decent people. I'm calling the police right now to have you removed from our community." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, not from fear but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with confrontation. However, his military training had taught him discipline and de-escalation. "Ma'am, I understand you might have concerns, but I assure you I'm a legitimate resident and veteran. If you'd like to verify my lease or military service, I'm happy to provide documentation." "Documentation?" Margaret laughed mockingly. "Anyone can fake papers these days. What I see is a suspicious person in a military costume who doesn't belong in our neighborhood. You need to remove that jacket immediately and leave our community before I have you arrested for trespassing and stolen valor." The small crowd of neighbors continued to grow. Some looked uncomfortable with Margaret's aggressive behavior, while others nodded in agreement. Marcus realized this situation was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. This woman seemed determined to humiliate him publicly, and he could feel the eyes of the entire neighborhood watching to see how he would respond. Marcus took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking away or getting into an argument, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With calm precision, he began typing a message to a group chat that he rarely used anymore. The chat was labeled Alpha Team Reunion and contained the contact information for 12 men who had served alongside him in some of the most dangerous missions the military had to offer. The message was simple: "Need backup at 1247, Elm Street, Maplewood Heights. Hostile situation involving disrespect to service. Not an emergency, but could use some brothers." As Marcus sent the message, Margaret continued her verbal assault, now accusing him of being a drug dealer and demanding that he strip off his jacket in front of everyone. She had no idea that she had just challenged not just one veteran, but a brotherhood that had faced down terrorists in the mountains of Afghanistan and survived firefights in the streets of Baghdad. Within seconds, Marcus's phone began buzzing with responses. Help was already on the way. Margaret's voice grew louder and more demanding as she realized Marcus wasn't backing down. "I said take off that jacket right now. You're disrespecting real soldiers by wearing that fake uniform. Security is on their way, and I've already called the police to report a trespasser." Marcus remained calm, though his phone continued buzzing in his pocket with incoming messages. He glanced at the growing crowd of neighbors, some recording the confrontation with their phones. Children had stopped their bikes to watch, and elderly residents peered from behind curtains. "Ma'am, I'm not causing any trouble. I'm simply collecting my mail from my own mailbox." "Your mailbox?" Margaret shrieked. "You don't live here? I would know if someone like you belonged in my neighborhood. This is Maplewood Heights, not some inner-city housing project. We have standards here, and those standards don't include military wannabes loitering around our community." The racist undertones weren't lost on Marcus or several of the neighbors who shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Chen, an elderly Asian woman who lived 2 houses down from Marcus, stepped forward with a troubled expression. "Margaret, I've seen this young man several times. He waves and says good morning. He seems very polite." Margaret whirled around to face Mrs. Chen with fury in her eyes. "Don't you dare defend him, Helen. You haven't lived here as long as I have. I know what's best for this community, and what's best is getting rid of people who don't belong here before they bring down our property values." During this exchange, Marcus checked his phone discreetly. The group chat was exploding with activity. Tommy Tank Rodriguez had responded first. "On my way, ETA 15 minutes. What's the situation?" Then came David Doc Williams. "Coming from the hospital, be there in 20. James Ghost Patterson wrote, already in the truck bringing Mike and Steve. These weren't just any veterans. Alpha Team had been an elite special forces unit that Marcus had served with for over 8 years. They had conducted classified operations in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Tommy Rodriguez had been their demolitions expert, known for his ability to defuse bombs under pressure. David Williams was a combat medic who had saved countless lives on the battlefield. James Patterson had earned the nickname Ghost for his ability to move unseen and unheard during reconnaissance missions. Margaret continued her tirade, now demanding that other neighbors call additional authorities. "Someone needs to contact the mayor's office. This is exactly what I warned about when they started allowing rentals in our neighborhood. First it's military pretenders, next it'll be gang members and drug dealers." Marcus's neighbor from across the street, Bob Martinez, a middle-aged accountant, finally spoke up. "Margaret, maybe you should calm down a bit. The man is just getting his mail. Even if you have concerns, this seems excessive." "Excessive?" Margaret spun around with wild eyes. "Bob Martinez, I am the president of this HOA, and I have every right to protect our community from undesirable elements. If you don't like how I handle things, you can move somewhere else." The crowd was growing larger and the tension was becoming palpable. Some neighbors were clearly uncomfortable with Margaret's behavior, while others seemed to support her aggressive stance. Marcus noted the division and realized this confrontation was revealing deeper issues within the community. At that moment, Marcus heard something that made him smile for the first time that morning. In the distance, the distinctive rumble of multiple motorcycle engines could be heard approaching. His phone buzzed with a message from Tommy. "Block party incoming. Hope you're ready for some fireworks." Margaret was too busy berating Bob Martinez to notice the approaching sound, but Marcus recognized the specific engines immediately. Tommy rode a Harley-Davidson Fat Boy that had been customized with a sound system that could wake the dead. James had a Kawasaki Ninja that he'd modified for both speed and style. The others drove trucks and SUVs, but they were all heading to Maplewood Heights with one purpose: supporting their brother. "Take off that jacket right now or I'm having you physically removed." Margaret screamed, her face red with rage. "I don't care if you have to stand here naked. You will not disrespect our military by wearing stolen clothes." Marcus looked at his watch. Based on the messages he'd received, his backup should be arriving any minute. He made a decision that would teach Margaret Whitman a lesson she would never forget. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you one last chance to apologize and walk away. My jacket isn't coming off and I'm not leaving my own neighborhood." "Your neighborhood?" Margaret laughed hysterically. "This will never be your neighborhood. People like you don't belong in places like this. You probably can't even afford to live here without government assistance or charity from bleeding heart liberals." The motorcycles were getting closer, and Marcus could now make out individual engines. He counted at least 4 bikes, which meant Tommy had brought additional team members beyond those who had initially responded. Marcus's smile widened as he realized Margaret was about to learn what it meant to disrespect not just one veteran, but an entire brotherhood of warriors. Mrs. Chen approached Marcus cautiously. "Young man, are you all right?" Margaret can be very difficult, but she doesn't speak for all of us. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen, I'm fine. And this situation is about to resolve itself," Marcus replied, his confidence growing with each passing second. Margaret overheard the exchange and became even more enraged. "Don't you encourage him, Helen. And you," she pointed at Marcus, "wipe that smug look off your face. The only thing that's going to resolve is your removal from our community. Security will be here any minute to drag you away." The motorcycle engines were now loud enough that everyone in the neighborhood could hear them clearly. Margaret finally noticed the sound and looked around with confusion. "What is that noise? Are those motorcycles?" "This is exactly what I'm talking about. First military imposters, now motorcycle gangs. This neighborhood is going straight downhill." Marcus checked his phone one more time. Tommy had sent a final message, eyes on target. "Beginning approach. Remember, we've got your 6, brother." As the sound of approaching motorcycles grew thunderous, Margaret continued her verbal assault, completely unaware that she was about to face a force unlike anything she had ever encountered. The president of the Maplewood Heights HOA was about to learn what happened when you disrespected a man who had earned the loyalty of America's finest warriors. The rumble of motorcycle engines grew so loud that conversations throughout the neighborhood stopped. Margaret looked around nervously as the sound echoed off the houses, but she was too committed to her confrontation to back down now. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she shouted over the noise. "Military pretenders and now motorcycle gangs. This neighborhood is being destroyed." Marcus stood calmly, his hands at his sides, watching Margaret continue her tirade while the thunderous sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air. He could identify each engine by its unique sound signature. Tommy's Harley had that deep rhythmic rumble that came from custom exhaust pipes. James's Kawasaki had a higher-pitched whine that spoke of pure speed and precision. The other engines belonged to brothers he hadn't seen in over a year, but who were racing across the city to stand beside him. The first motorcycle turned the corner onto Elm Street at exactly 8:47 a.m. Tommy Tank Rodriguez appeared on his massive Harley-Davidson, wearing his leather jacket with Special Forces patches clearly visible. His bike was followed immediately by James Ghost Patterson on his sleek Kawasaki Ninja, then David Doc Williams on a Honda Goldwing touring bike. Behind them came 3 pickup trucks and an SUV, all carrying additional team members who had received the call for backup. Margaret's eyes widened as she watched the convoy pull up in front of the mailbox cluster. The motorcycles arranged themselves in a perfect formation, engines still running, creating an impressive display of precision that only came from military training. The trucks and SUV parked strategically, blocking any escape routes and ensuring that the situation remained contained. "What is this?" Margaret stammered, suddenly realizing that she might have miscalculated the situation badly. "Are you people threatening me?" "I'm calling the police right now." Tommy Rodriguez removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face with kind eyes and graying temples. Despite his intimidating appearance, he spoke in a calm, measured voice that commanded instant respect. "Ma'am, nobody here is threatening anyone. We received word that our brother was being harassed and we came to provide support." "Your brother?" Margaret looked back and forth between Marcus and the growing group of veterans. "This man is not your brother. He's a fake soldier wearing a costume, and now he's called in some kind of motorcycle gang to intimidate honest citizens." Ghost Patterson dismounted his bike with fluid grace, his movements so quiet and precise that several neighbors jumped when he suddenly appeared beside Tommy. At 6'4" with broad shoulders and muscled arms covered in military tattoos, Ghost was an imposing figure. However, like Tommy, his voice remained respectful and controlled. "Ma'am, Marcus Thompson served with our Special Forces unit for 8 years. He's a decorated combat veteran who earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. There's nothing fake about his service or his right to wear that jacket." Doc Williams approached the group, carrying a medical bag that he never left behind even on social visits. At 52 years old, he was the oldest member of the team, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a college professor than a combat medic. "Marcus saved my life in Afghanistan in 2019, he said quietly. "He carried me 3 miles through enemy territory after an IED explosion left me unconscious. If anyone has a problem with his jacket, they have a problem with all of us." More team members emerged from the vehicles. Steve Bulldog Morrison, a former machine gunner built like a refrigerator with hands the size of dinner plates. Mike Eagle Eye Chen, a former sniper whose calm demeanor masked lightning-fast reflexes. Carlos Priest Morales, a former chaplain's assistant who could quote the Bible and field strip an M4 rifle with equal skill. Each man positioned himself strategically around the mailbox area, not as a threat, but as an unmistakable show of solidarity. The neighborhood crowd had grown to over 30 people, including children who stared in awe at the impressive display of motorcycles and military bearing. Many residents pulled out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a significant event in Maplewood Heights history. Margaret looked around at the assembled veterans, realizing that her assumptions about Marcus had been catastrophically wrong. However, her pride and stubbornness prevented her from admitting her mistake. Instead, she doubled down on her aggressive stance. "I don't care what you people claim about military service. This is private property and you're all trespassing. I'm the president of this HOA and I have the authority to have all of you arrested." Tommy stepped forward, his voice remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a public street and a shared mailbox facility. We're not on private property, and we're not breaking any laws. What we are doing is supporting a brother who has been unjustly harassed and accused of stolen valor." "Stolen valor?" Margaret's voice cracked as she began to realize the gravity of her accusations. "I never said anything about stolen valor." Ghost pulled out his smartphone and began playing a recording. Margaret's voice came through the speaker clearly. "Real soldiers don't dress like that in civilian areas. You're probably some homeless person or criminal trying to scam sympathy from decent people. Anyone can fake papers these days. You need to remove that jacket immediately. You're disrespecting real soldiers by wearing that fake uniform." The crowd gasped as they heard Margaret's own words played back to her. Several neighbors looked embarrassed for having witnessed such a public display of ignorance and prejudice. Mrs. Chen shook her head sadly, while Bob Martinez openly stared at Margaret with disgust. Doc Williams stepped forward, his medical training making him sensitive to the psychological impact of the confrontation. "Ma'am, accusing a veteran of stolen valor is a serious matter. It's not just insulting. It's potentially illegal under federal law. More importantly, It causes real psychological harm to men and women who have already sacrificed so much for their country. Margaret's face had gone from red with rage to pale with realization. She looked around at the assembled veterans, noting their genuine military tattoos, their disciplined bearing, and the obvious bonds of brotherhood that connected them. For the first time since the confrontation began, doubt crept into her voice. But he doesn't look like a soldier. He's not what I expected. Bulldog Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced enemy fire on multiple continents. Ma'am, what exactly does a soldier look like? Because I've served alongside men and women of every race, every background, every economic level, and every faith. The only thing that matters in combat is whether someone will stand beside you when everything goes wrong. Carlos Morales added quietly, Marcus Thompson never left a man behind. He never hesitated to put himself in harm's way for his brothers. He earned every patch on that jacket through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The color of his skin doesn't change any of that. Margaret stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by genuine American heroes who had traveled across the city to defend their brother's honor. The weight of her accusations and the reality of her prejudice began to sink in. However, the most important lesson was yet to come. Margaret stood frozen as the reality of her situation became clear. She was surrounded by genuine American heroes, men who had risked their lives in foreign lands, and she had just spent 20 minutes publicly humiliating one of their own, based on nothing more than prejudice and assumptions. The neighborhood crowd continued to grow, with residents emerging from houses throughout the community, to witness what had become a defining moment for Maplewood Heights. Eagle Eye Chen, the former sniper, stepped forward with a manila folder in his hands. His voice was quiet but carried the precision of someone accustomed to making every word count. Ma'am, since you demanded documentation, I took the liberty of printing some paperwork during my drive over here. He opened the folder and began reading from official military documents. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson, United States Army Special Forces, enlisted 2008, honorable discharge 2023, Afghanistan deployment 2010-2011, Iraq deployment 2013-2014, Afghanistan again 2018-2019. Ghost Patterson added his own folder to the evidence. Combat Infantry Badge, 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star with V device for Valor, Army Commendation Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, Iraq Campaign Medal. He looked directly at Margaret. Ma'am, this man has more decorations than most soldiers accumulate in 20 years of service. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the official documents. The seals, signatures, and military formatting were clearly authentic. There was no way these could be faked, especially not with the level of detail and cross-referencing that the veterans were providing. I don't understand. Why would he be wearing his uniform in a civilian neighborhood? Doc Williams adjusted his glasses and spoke with the patience of someone who had spent years counseling trauma victims. Ma'am, that's not a uniform. It's a jacket. Many veterans wear pieces of military clothing as a way of maintaining connection to their service and their brothers. It's completely legal and actually quite common. Tommy Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice remaining respectful but firm. Ma'am, what you did today wasn't just rude or inappropriate. You publicly accused a decorated combat veteran of stolen valor based entirely on the color of his skin and your own prejudices. Do you understand how serious that is? The crowd murmured as Tommy's words sank in. Several neighbors looked ashamed of their community's HOA president. Mrs. Chen stepped forward and spoke directly to Margaret. Margaret Whitman, I have lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I have watched you bully and intimidate residents over the smallest violations of HOA rules. But this is different. This is hate and prejudice disguised as community standards. Bob Martinez nodded in agreement. Margaret, I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt over the years, but this is inexcusable. You assumed this man was a criminal based on his appearance and then doubled down when he tried to explain himself politely. Margaret looked around desperately, searching for support among the neighbors, but found only disappointed faces and shaking heads. Even her usual allies on the HOA board, who had supported her strict enforcement policies in the past, seemed horrified by her behavior. Bulldog Morrison pulled out his own phone and began scrolling through photos. Ma'am, I want to show you something. This is Marcus during our deployment in Afghanistan in 2019. He held up a photo showing Marcus in full combat gear, weapon in hand, standing beside his team members in a rocky, mountainous landscape. This is him after a firefight where he saved 3 civilians and carried Doc to safety under enemy fire. The photo passed through the crowd, with neighbors examining the clear evidence of Marcus's service. Children pointed at the military equipment and asked their parents questions about soldiers in war. The contrast between the heroic figure in the photograph and Margaret's accusations became stark and undeniable. Priest Morales stepped forward with a gentle expression that reflected his background in military counseling. "Ma'am, I believe you. Made an honest mistake based on misconceptions and stereotypes. The question now is what you're going to do to make it right." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" "You publicly humiliated a decorated veteran in front of his neighbors," Ghost said quietly. "You questioned his service, demanded he strip off his jacket, accused him of crimes, and called the police on him for the offense of checking his mail while black. That requires more than just an apology." Doc Williams nodded. "Ma'am, Marcus has been struggling with the transition from military to civilian life, like many veterans do. He moved to this neighborhood hoping to find peace and community. Instead, he found hostility and accusations. That kind of treatment can cause serious psychological harm to someone who has already dealt with combat trauma." Margaret looked at Marcus for the first time since his brothers had arrived. Really looked at him. She saw a young man who had remained calm and respectful throughout her entire tirade. She saw someone who had served his country with honor and was now being defended by men who clearly respected and loved him as family. For the first time, she began to see him as a person rather than a threat. "Marcus," she said hesitantly, I think I made a terrible mistake." Marcus had remained silent during most of the confrontation, letting his brothers speak for him while he observed the situation with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones. Now he stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "Ma'am, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to see a threat where there wasn't one. You chose to assume the worst about someone based on their appearance. You chose to publicly humiliate someone rather than having a private conversation about your concerns." The crowd was completely silent as Marcus continued. "The question now is what choice you're going to make next. You can learn from this and become a better person and a better leader for your community. Or you can double down on your prejudices and continue to be the kind of person who drives good people away from neighborhoods like this." Tommy Rodriguez placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Brother, whatever you decide you want to do about this situation, we've got your back. All of us." The other team members nodded in agreement, forming a protective semicircle around Marcus. It was clear that these men would follow his lead, whether he chose forgiveness, confrontation, or something in between. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, veterans who had served their country, neighbors who were disappointed in her leadership, and children who were learning about prejudice and justice in real time. She realized that her next words would define not only her relationship with Marcus, but her legacy as a community leader and as a human being. The moment of truth had arrived. Margaret stood in the center of the circle, her face pale and her hands shaking as the full weight of her actions settled upon her. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of morning traffic and the occasional whisper from the crowd of neighbors. She looked at Marcus, then at his brothers who had traveled across the city to defend his honor, and finally at her own neighbors who were staring at her with disappointment and disgust. Margaret's voice cracked as she tried to speak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I need to apologize. To you, Marcus, and to everyone who witnessed my behavior today." She paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to someone who had spent years believing she was always right. "I was wrong. Not just wrong about the facts, but wrong in my heart." Tommy Rodriguez remained silent, allowing Margaret to continue without interruption. The experienced sergeant knew that real change had to come from within, and pushing too hard could cause someone to retreat back into defensiveness rather than genuine growth. "When I saw you in that jacket," Margaret continued, looking directly at Marcus, "I didn't see a person. I didn't see a neighbor. I saw what my fears and prejudices told me to see. I saw a threat to my perfect little world where everyone looks the same and acts the same and thinks the same. Tears began flowing down her cheeks as she spoke. I called you names, questioned your honor, and tried to humiliate you in front of our entire neighborhood. There is no excuse for that behavior. Doc Williams stepped forward slightly, his medical training recognizing the signs of genuine emotional breakthrough. He had counseled enough soldiers through difficult realizations to know when someone was truly confronting their own failures, rather than simply trying to escape consequences. Ma'am, Doc said gently, recognizing the problem is the first step. But what matters now is what you do next. Margaret nodded, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand. You're right. An apology isn't enough, especially after what I put Marcus through. She looked around at the assembled crowd, many of whom were still recording the confrontation with their phones. I need to make this right publicly, since I made the accusations publicly. She took a deep breath and raised her voice so that everyone in the growing crowd could hear her clearly. My name is Margaret Whitman, and I am the president of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association. This morning, I publicly accused Marcus Thompson of stolen valor and questioned his right to live in our community based solely on the color of his skin and my own ignorant assumptions. The crowd murmured as Margaret continued her public confession. Several neighbors looked surprised that she was being so direct about her motivations and actions. Marcus Thompson is a decorated United States Army veteran who served multiple combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. He earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and numerous other commendations for his service to our country.
He has every right to wear that jacket, to live in this neighborhood,
and to be treated with the respect that any hero deserves. Ghost Patterson nodded approvingly at Margaret's words, but his expression remained serious. Public apologies were important, but they needed to be followed by concrete actions to have real meaning. Marcus listened to Margaret's apology with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. His military training had taught him to assess situations carefully before responding, and he was evaluating whether Margaret's words represented genuine remorse or simply an attempt to minimize consequences. Ma'am, Marcus said finally, I appreciate your apology, and I can see that you're genuinely upset about what happened. But I need you to understand something important. This isn't just about me. Your reaction to seeing me in this neighborhood reveals deeper problems that affect how you treat all residents who don't fit your expectations. Eagle eye. Chen stepped forward, his sniper's precision extending to his choice of words. Ma'am, in the military, we learn that trust is earned through consistent actions over time, not just words spoken in crisis moments. The question is whether you're willing to do the work necessary to earn back the trust of this community. Margaret looked around at her neighbors, many of whom were people she had clashed with over HOA violations and community standards in the past. She began to realize that her treatment of Marcus wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that had made her feared, rather than respected as a leader. What would you need to see from me? Margaret asked, directing her question to Marcus, but speaking loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. Bulldog Morrison, who had remained mostly silent during the confrontation, stepped forward with a suggestion. Ma'am, words are easy. Actions are harder. If you really want to make this right, you need to use your position as HOA president to make sure this community becomes more welcoming to all residents, regardless of their background. Priest Morales added his own perspective. Ma'am, in the military chaplaincy, we learned that true repentance requires not just asking for forgiveness, but actively working to repair the harm that was caused and prevent it from happening again. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching the entire confrontation with growing disappointment, stepped forward to address Margaret directly. Margaret, you have been HOA president for 6 years. In that time, you have made this community less welcoming, not more. You fined people for minor violations, harassed families over decorations, and created an atmosphere of fear rather than neighborliness. This incident with Marcus is just the most extreme example of a long-standing problem. Bob Martinez nodded in agreement. Margaret, if you really want to make this right, you need to look at how you've been using your authority as HOA president. You've been more interested in controlling people than serving the community. Margaret felt the weight of years of complaints and conflicts settling on her shoulders. She realized that her neighbor's criticisms weren't just about this morning's confrontation, but about her entire approach to community leadership. The recognition was painful but necessary. "You're all right," Margaret said quietly. "I've been so focused on maintaining what I thought were proper standards that I forgot the most important standard of all, treating people with basic human decency and respect." Marcus watched Margaret's face carefully, using the same skills that had helped him evaluate potential threats and allies in combat zones. He was looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated self-preservation. What he saw was a woman who was truly confronting her own failures for perhaps the first time in years. "Margaret," Marcus said, using her first name for the first time, "I believe you're sincere about wanting to change. But change is hard work, and it requires more than just good intentions. It requires consistent action over time, even when nobody is watching." Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward with a practical suggestion. "Ma'am, if you really want to make this right, here's what I would recommend. First, you need to publicly resign from the HOA board and allow new leadership to emerge. Second, you need to attend sensitivity training to understand how your biases affect your treatment of others. Third, you need to personally apologize to every resident you've treated poorly during your time as president." The crowd murmured at Tommy's suggestions, which were clearly designed to hold Margaret accountable while providing a path toward redemption. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, particularly those who had been on the receiving end of Margaret's aggressive enforcement policies in the past. Doc Williams added his own recommendation. "Ma'am, you should also consider volunteering with veteran support organizations. Marcus isn't the only veteran in this country who faces discrimination and misunderstanding from civilians. You could turn this experience into something positive by helping other veterans navigate similar challenges." Margaret listened to the suggestions with growing resolve. She realized that this moment represented a crossroads in her life. She could either retreat into defensiveness and resentment, or she could use this painful experience as an opportunity for genuine growth and positive change. "I accept all of those suggestions," Margaret said firmly. "I will resign from the HOA board effective immediately. I will attend sensitivity training and anger management counseling. And I will personally apologize to every resident I have wronged during my time as president." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "And I would like to volunteer with veteran organizations, if you think that would be helpful rather than harmful." Marcus considered her offer carefully. He had seen enough combat to know that enemies could become allies under the right circumstances, but it required genuine transformation rather than surface-level changes. "Margaret," Marcus said finally, "I think your help could be valuable to veteran organizations, but only after you've done the personal work necessary to examine and change your biases. Veterans, especially veterans of color, don't need more people in their support networks who see them as threats rather than heroes." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 police cars, responding to Margaret's earlier call. The officers emerged from their vehicles and immediately assessed the situation. A large crowd of neighbors, multiple motorcycles, and what appeared to be a peaceful but tense. 3 months later, the transformation of Maplewood Heights was remarkable. What had started as a morning confrontation over a camouflage jacket had become a catalyst for positive change throughout the entire community. Margaret Whitman had kept every promise she made that day, beginning with her immediate resignation from the HOA board. The new HOA president was Bob Martinez, who had been elected unanimously after running on a platform of community inclusion and reasonable enforcement of neighborhood standards. His first act was to revise the HOA rules to focus on actual property maintenance rather than arbitrary aesthetic preferences. The thick packet of regulations that Marcus had received when he moved in was replaced with a simple, 2-page document emphasizing respect for neighbors and common-sense community standards. Margaret had enrolled in sensitivity training classes at the local community college and was attending weekly sessions with a counselor who specialized in helping people overcome unconscious bias. The process was difficult and sometimes painful, but she was committed to understanding how her privileged background had shaped her perceptions and reactions to people who were different from her. More importantly, Margaret had begun volunteering at the Veterans Community Support Center downtown, where she helped with paperwork, organized food drives, and assisted with job placement programs for transitioning military personnel. Her supervisor, a Vietnam veteran named Robert Jackson, had been initially skeptical of her motivations but was gradually impressed by her dedication and genuine desire to learn. Margaret started out trying to help in ways that made her feel good about herself. Robert had told Marcus during one of their conversations, but she's learned to listen to what veterans actually need, rather than what she thinks they should want. That's real growth. Marcus had become something of a neighborhood celebrity, not because of the confrontation, but because of how he had handled it with such grace and dignity. Children in the neighborhood would wave to him during his morning walks, and several neighbors had asked him to share stories about his military service during community gatherings. Mrs. Chen had organized a neighborhood barbecue specifically to welcome Marcus and celebrate the community's new commitment to inclusion. The event had been attended by over 60 residents, including several other veterans who lived in the area but had previously kept their service history private due to concerns about how they might be received. Tommy, Rodriguez, and the other members of Alpha Team had become regular visitors to Maplewood Heights, often joining Marcus for weekend barbecues and community events. Their presence had enriched the neighborhood's understanding of military service and the bonds that connect veterans long after their active duty ends. "It's funny," Tommy had remarked to Marcus during one visit. "Margaret turns out to be one of our most effective advocates now. She understands better than most civilians how harmful it can be when people make assumptions about veterans based on appearance or background." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some longtime residents had initially resisted the changes to HOA policies, arguing that relaxed standards would hurt property values. However, the opposite had proven true. The neighborhood's reputation for inclusivity and community spirit had actually increased demand from potential homebuyers, leading to a modest increase in property values across the community. Margaret's personal transformation had been the most dramatic of all. The woman who had once patrolled the neighborhood looking for violations now spent her time organizing community events and mediating disputes between neighbors through dialogue, rather than enforcement actions. Her approach to problems had shifted from punishment-based to solution-focused. "I spent so many years being afraid that any change would ruin our community," Margaret had told Marcus during a private conversation 6 months after their initial confrontation. "I was so focused on maintaining what I thought was perfect that I couldn't see how much better things could be if we actually worked together instead of against each other." The story of the morning confrontation had spread beyond Maplewood Heights through social media and local news coverage. Several other HOA communities had reached out to Bob Martinez for advice on creating more inclusive neighborhood policies. Marcus had been invited to speak at veteran support groups about handling discrimination with dignity and strength. The most significant change, however, was in the daily life of the neighborhood itself. Children played together across racial and ethnic lines, without the tension that had previously existed. Neighbors borrowed tools from each other and shared vegetables from their gardens. Community meetings focused on positive projects rather than complaints and violations. Marcus's house at 1247 Elm Street had become a gathering place for both longtime residents and newcomers. His front porch was always open to neighbors who wanted to chat, and his garage had been converted into an informal community workshop where residents could borrow tools and work on projects together. Eagle Eye, Chen had helped Marcus organize a neighborhood watch program that focused on community support rather than suspicion. Instead of looking for potential threats, the watch program connected elderly residents with younger neighbors who could help with yard work and home maintenance. Doc Williams had established an informal first aid training program in the community center, teaching residents basic emergency medical skills while sharing stories about the importance of looking out for each other in times of crisis. One evening, as Marcus sat on his front porch watching children play in the street while their parents chatted nearby, Margaret approached with a letter in her hands. "Marcus, I wanted to share something with you," she said, settling into the chair beside him that had become her usual spot during their weekly conversations. "I received a letter from the Veterans Community Support Center today." She unfolded the letter and read aloud. "Mrs. Whitman, your volunteer work over the past year has made a significant difference in the lives of numerous veterans transitioning to civilian life. Your fundraising efforts have allowed us to expand our job placement program, and your advocacy work has helped change policies at 3 local businesses that were inadvertently discriminating against veteran job applicants, Margaret folded the letter and looked at Marcus with tears in her eyes. A year ago, I was the kind of person who caused pain to veterans. Today, I'm being recognized for helping them. That transformation happened because you and your brothers chose to respond to my hatred with education instead of anger. Marcus smiled and gestured toward the busy street where neighbors of all backgrounds were enjoying the evening together. Margaret, look around. This whole community transformed because we all chose to grow instead of staying stuck in old patterns. You did the hard work of changing yourself, but everyone here contributed to making this neighborhood better. As the sun set over Maplewood Heights, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought the community to this point. A confrontation that could have escalated into lasting division had instead become the foundation for genuine unity and understanding. The camouflage jacket that had sparked such controversy now hung proudly in his closet next to the civilian clothes he wore to community meetings and neighborhood barbecues. The brotherhood that had answered his call for backup that morning had expanded to include an entire neighborhood of people who had learned to see past their differences and work together for the common good. It was, Marcus thought, exactly the kind of community worth serving and protecting.